Welcome back for Lesson 10, The Rise of Christianity in the Middle Ages in Europe. Some of today's learning objectives include tracing the origins of Christianity and describing the religion's importance by the Middle Ages, describing the influence of the Catholic Church on life and politics in the Middle Ages, defining feudalism in Europe, and explaining the motives for the Crusades. We're also going to look at other topics, including the Black Death. Christianity defines the European Middle Ages, but we will first look at the origins of the religion to understand its context, because we can't really understand how important the Christian Church or the Catholic Church is during the Middle Ages without understanding the origins of Christianity and the rise of Christianity as a religion. We've briefly talked about Christianity when we looked at the Roman lesson, but we're going to look into it a little bit more in detail and look at the foundations. In the past, we've talked about Abrahamic religion, monotheistic religions that have a relation to Abraham. We've looked at Judaism in detail, and we've looked at Islam in detail. We briefly mentioned Christianity during the Roman lesson, but today we're going to look a little closer at Christianity so we can understand how important the religion becomes by the Middle Ages in Europe. So to do that, we need to look at foundations and traditions. In the Jewish religion, it is stated that a Messiah will come, someone that will save the people. And Jesus of Nazareth is born sometimes around 3 BCE, and he proclaims that he is the Messiah. Some Jewish people will convert, not a lot to start with. Some Jewish people do not believe he is the Messiah, but Jesus of Nazareth proclaims that he is the Messiah and the Son of God. The teachings of Jesus follow traditional Jewish laws, customs, and traditions because Jesus lives and dies as a Jew. But there is one major exception to Jesus' teaching. He teaches in his own name and not in the name of Yahweh. Prophets before Jesus, they spoke in the name of Yahweh, but Jesus is different because he's proclaimed that he is the Messiah and that he is preaching in his own name. One thing that occurs is many Jewish people are going to be disappointed in Jesus. Why are these Jewish people disappointed in Jesus? Many of the Jews are living in an area called Judea, and at the time, it was under Roman control. And the Jews of the time thought that their Messiah would be a military leader who would overthrow Roman rule, because the Romans were really oppressing the Jewish people, and the Jewish people were really fed up. They wanted a Messiah to come and save them from these Roman people and push the Roman people out of Judea. Instead, Jesus will not be a military leader. He's actually going to preach and teach, and he is going to talk about the kingdom of heaven. He even says, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's." So he believed that people should pay taxes to their government because that's Caesar's at that particular time. The main focus of the teachings of Jesus are love and avoidance of violence. So he's not going to try to overthrow the Roman rule. He tries to live within the system of government that he is growing up in. He also taught that traditional Jewish laws should be followed. So they should be followed, but he is going to note that Christians are not going to be people that are people of the law, but he still encourages people to follow Jewish law. We will talk about 4 different reactions to Jesus, and as you can imagine, reactions to Jesus were mixed. As I said, there are some people that are really upset because they wanted a Messiah that would overthrow the Roman government, but here are 4 other examples to reactions to Jesus. There are the Pharisees, and the Pharisees are strict observers of the Torah, and they're often seen as religious leaders in the Jewish community. Now, the Pharisees had an issue because Jesus taught in his own name and not in the name of Yahweh. They really believed that Jesus was breaking some of the Jewish laws and customs. The second group are called the Sadducees, and they are people who combine Jewish and Roman culture together, and they had an issue with Jesus because they didn't believe in a spirit world or the resurrection of the dead. They only believed in Jewish law. And one of the things with Jesus is he dies and rises again. So the Sadducees are not going to believe in that because they don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. The third group are called Zealots. And Zealots were violent revolutionaries. And so this doesn't really mess with Jesus' message of peace. They had an issue with Jesus because he taught peace and love instead of revolution. And the fourth one that we're going to talk about is Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is the Roman governor of Judea. So he controls and administers that particular province. And he didn't really mind Jesus proclaiming himself to be the king of the Jews. But what he did have an issue is this growing unrest in Judea. And so he had this issue with all the groups who disliked Jesus of Nazareth. And so he wanted to try to appease those people, and he thought a rebellion was brewing. And so he thought the easiest way to stop this rebellion was to get rid of the problem, or to kind of appease these people. And so that's one reason he agrees to execute Jesus. And so Jesus will be crucified on a cross at the age of 33, and following the Christian tradition, he rises again 3 days later. Believe it or not, Jesus lived and died as a Jew. So people at that point were not called Christians. Peter's first sermon following the death of Jesus is really important, because Peter preaches that Jesus has died and been resurrected. So he lived, he was crucified, and he resurrected to live with Yahweh. So he's gone to heaven to live with God. Another thing that's important is baptism. Baptism becomes the mark of those who accept the resurrection of Jesus. So shortly after the death of Jesus, followers of Jesus and Peter began to spread the new religion throughout Asia, and they actively seek converts to Christianity. So during the life of Jesus Christ, he really teaches from the age 30 till the time he's put to death at 33. He has 12 followers that you've probably heard of, and those 12 followers are going to help spread the message. An example would be Paul, another example would be Peter or John. But followers of Jesus are going to help spread this new religion. There aren't just 12, but those are his 12 disciples. And so he will have others that follow him as well, and they'll help spread the religion. But the 12 are going to be very important to spreading his religion. So one thing I said is they actively seek converts. This is very different from Judaism, because Jews do not seek converts, but Christians actively seek converts to believe in Jesus. Shortly after the death of Jesus Christ, we will see his followers spread Christianity and actively convert people to Christianity. One of the people that does this is Paul of Tarsus. He once was called Saul of Tarsus, but he has a conversion experience on the Damascus Road. But Saul of Tarsus, or Paul of Tarsus, will change Christianity from a small sect of Judaism into a full-fledged religion. He's going to get a lot of people to convert to Christianity and follow Jesus Christ and believe that he is the Messiah. So Paul of Tarsus grew up in the Greco-Roman world as Saul of Tarsus, and we know because he grew up in the Greco-Roman world, he was able to speak different languages, and he was able to speak to crowds both large and small. He tried to answer many questions that people have. Do you have to accept both Judaism and Christianity? Are Christians still subject to the law of Moses? So, those are some tricky questions to answer. We know that Christians still follow the Old Testament and read the Old Testament, but they also have the New Testament, the teachings of Jesus Christ, and it also incorporates some of Jesus' disciples' works as well. But Jesus Christ says that he will cover people's sins and that they're no longer subject to the laws of Moses. It doesn't mean that they're not important, because the Ten Commandments are still important to the Christian people, but Jesus will cover those sins. Paul preaches by saying that Jesus was the Son of God, and Jesus gave people a new set of laws. And the teaching of Jesus were open to all. So Christianity will appeal to a lot of people because it's open to everyone, and it does provide some equality. The appeal of Christianity will be widespread because of this. It will be embraced by men and women, slaves and nobles. It was inclusive and welcomed all, and it created a sense of belonging for many people, and it promised salvation through accepting Jesus Christ and access to an afterlife. But early Christians will be persecuted, especially in the Roman Empire, until Constantine accepts Christianity and makes it acceptable. And we talked about Constantine when we talked about the Roman lecture, but he will be the first Roman emperor to accept Jesus Christ as his personal savior. And this really makes Christianity more acceptable in that part of the Roman world. And remember, that's that's really going to be the eastern part of the Roman world, because the western part of the Roman world is declining. So now we're going to take a look at the Middle Ages, because that really is the main topic of today's lesson. The Middle Ages is the time from the fall of Rome in 476 to approximately 1400. Sometimes the Middle Ages are called the Dark Ages or the Medieval Era. It's called the Dark Ages because there's not a lot of scholarship or artwork going on during this time period. There is culture, there is some artwork and some scholarly sources coming out, but not as much as, say, the time of the Renaissance. And it's also sometimes called the Medieval Era because it's during this time of feudalism. The church was a dominating institution in the Middle Ages. It really was the dominating institution in the Middle Ages. And we're going to look at different parts of the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, then we'll look at the High Middle Ages, which is the 11th century to the 13th century, and then the Late Middle Ages, and that will be from around 1300 to 1500. So it kind of overlaps because the period really ends around 1400. But sometimes people will say the Late Middle Ages are 1300 to 1500. And so that's what we're going to look at during this time period. And during the early part of the Middle Ages, we will see some groups of people like the Ostrogoths thrive. And this is an example of an Ostrogoth coin. We're going to look at the Byzantine Empire in the Middle Ages. And you've already met the Byzantine Empire. We talked about the Eastern Roman Empire in our Roman lecture, and this is often called the Byzantine Empire. So we're talking about the Eastern Roman Empire. Since we last talked about Rome, a lot has happened. Constantine and Maxentius fought at Milvian Bridge. You've already read about Milvian Bridge and did a discussion post on Milvian Bridge. And the Roman Empire was split into two different pieces. This separation officially happened in 395 AD. The Western Roman Empire ended in 476 AD when Flavius, a German barbarian, overthrows Romulus Augustulus and proclaims himself king. So Rome has fallen to what is considered a barbarian at the time. But the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, is still thriving at this point in time. It's a Hellenistic culture, so it really thrives and focuses on the Greek culture. It was also more populous and more urbanized and wealthier than the western part of the Roman Empire by that point. Byzantium becomes the capital city, but as we talked about in the Roman lecture, it eventually becomes Constantinople. It will be named this by the son of the Emperor Constantine. So, it becomes Constantinople. Today it's Istanbul, Turkey, but Byzantium and Constantinople has a Roman-style Senate, Roman-style laws, and Roman-style magistrate, but Greek culture. So if we're looking at the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire, there are two really important emperors, Theodosius II and Justinian. Theodosius II reigned from 408 to 450 AD, and one thing that he really did was create a powerful empire. So he expanded the Eastern Roman Empire. He compiled all the Roman laws and arranged them, and he gave these laws to Germanic kingdoms or people known as barbarians, and this helped keep the peace and it gave Germanic kingdoms laws and regulations. The other important Byzantine emperor is named Justinian, and he reigned from 527 to 565 AD, and he's given the nickname the Emperor that never sleeps. His wife is Theodora, and she is also his advisor, and she convinced Justinian to give women some rights. And he's best known for the Justinian codes. He actually builds these codes based on the work of Theodosius II. And it came in three parts: the code, which were actually the laws, the digest, and the digests were written by judges to kind of understand the law, and the institutes. It is a textbook for law students. So these two emperors helped grow the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire, and they helped establish law in the Byzantine Empire. Over time, the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire will face some resistance and invasion, and it really begins during the reign of an emperor called Heraclius, and he rules from 610 to 641. And Byzantine Empire will have to resist Persian and Islamic invaders. In 628, Heraclius defeated the Persians, and he actually took back a relic. The Islamic people had taken some of the relics from the Christians and Jewish people, and so he takes back some of these relics. After 632, the Islamic army are going to put pressure on the Eastern Empire. From 632 onward, for the rest of Heraclius' rule, there's really going to be pushing pressure on this Byzantine Empire from outside forces. So after his rules, and by the mid 670s, Islamic armies are actually going to invade Constantinople. And so there's going to be tensions because there's these Islamic armies that keep trying to take over Constantinople, to keep trying to take over the Eastern Empire. Finally, under the rule of Leo III, who rules from 717 to 740, the Byzantine armies are able to repel Islamic armies and regain control of Asia Minor. And they'll really be in control of Asia Minor and of Constantinople for several centuries after this. We're going to briefly talk about Christianity in the Byzantine Empire. This is actually an image of Hagia Sophia, and it was built in 537 AD, and it was the most elaborate church in all of Christianity at the time, and you can kind of see the architecture, and it still exists today, but it is a mosque now, not a church. It was later conquered by Islamic forces and turned into a mosque. And so Christianity was really thriving in the Byzantine Empire in the 500s and the 600s, and you even see churches being constructed, especially this very elaborate church, Hagia Sophia. There will be tensions in Christianity that occur, and this leads to something called the First Great Schism, and it occurs in 1054 AD. And schism means a divide, a great divide. And what happens here is there's going to be the creation of the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church will be very popular in Europe, and the Orthodox Church is going to be more popular in Eastern Europe and in Asia Minor. One of the things that really leads to this First Great Schism or divide are different theological ideas. One example is fighting over the type of bread used at communion, the power of the Pope, and the source of the Holy Spirit. So these are three things that they're really struggling with and they don't agree on. And so this will lead to the division of the church, because at first it was just a Christian church. But with this First Great Schism, we will see the Orthodox Church emerge and the Catholic Church emerge. So, was this Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire a continuation of Rome, or was it something new? The Byzantine Empire did use Roman laws. It used a Roman-style government, and it was originally part of the Roman Empire. But it is different because it's located where Asia and Europe meet. They spoke Greek in the Byzantine Empire, not Latin, and they were seen as others by both the East and the West, so both by Europe and Asia. The Middle Ages. We'll go back to the fall of Rome in 476 AD. Rome actually falls to a group of people called the Ostrogoths, but they're part of a larger group of people, sometimes called Germanic peoples or barbarians. So let's take a look at these barbarians in Europe at the end of the 5th century. And we have the Ostrogoths, who are in modern-day Italy, the Franks in northern Gaul, and then the Visigoths in southern Gaul and Spain, and the Vandals in Africa and western Mediterranean, and the Angles and the Saxons in England. That's how you get the term Anglo-Saxon in England today. But these groups of people functioned in these territories, but they were always looking to take over more, and they were known as the barbarians, and they're going to struggle for a little while as European society is evolving, and they're going to struggle for control over the areas. We're going to see Europe change from groups of different barbarians, particularly Western Europe, shaping from different groups of barbarians to kingdoms as we go through the Middle Ages. So we do see barbarian victories, but we see Roman culture survive. Roman culture will continue to prevail even as barbarians win. Except in England and Northern Gaul, Roman law, government, and language coexist with new Germanic institutions. The Vandals, Anglo-Saxons, and later, after 466, the Visigoths refused to profess obedience to the emperor in Constantinople. Remember, Constantinople is a very long way away, and these Germanic people just did not feel like they had to pledge allegiance to the emperor in Constantinople. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Vandals were Christian, but they were often seen as heretics by other barbarians because They were polytheistic originally. By 500, the Franks settled in Gaul and converted to Catholic form of Christianity and dominated Western Europe and spread Roman Catholicism. So we're really going to see the Franks really emerge as one of the more powerful barbarian groups, and they're going to try to set up a kingdom as time goes on. So Christianity in the Middle Ages. There is a hierarchy. It is broken down into people, priests, and bishops. The people are believers, so your common everyday believer. Then you have priests who serve the community. They're the shepherd of their flock, they're believers. And then you have bishops at the top, and the bishops are the teachers. They teach priests, and they teach the people. At this point in time, before the First Great Schism, so before the 11th century, we will have 5 bishops. There will be a bishop in Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. All 5 of these bishops are supposed to be equal, but that's not really the case. The Bishop of Rome really becomes more powerful because all of Europe basically looks toward the bishop in Rome. So he really becomes the first among equals. We do know that early Christianity is based around monks and monasteries. When a person became a monk, they had to give up their businesses, they had to give up their family, so reject all earthly possessions. And they became part of the Christian church. That became their family, and they became monks. And what monks did during this time period is they studied Christianity, but they also copied books. They collected books. So there is no printing press at this time. The only way to make another copy of the Bible at this time is for a person to sit there and handwrite that Bible. Monks are well known during this time period for hand copying the Bible and other religious texts. But as time moves on, Christianity is really going to become the glue that holds Europe together. So there are a lot of different groups that want different territory and whatnot, but one thing they do have in common is Christianity. There is some religious diversity in Christianity at this point. Since the 5th century, the rulers in Constantinople had close ties to the Eastern Church. The bishops that were in the Eastern Roman Empire, they're going to be closer to them. There was a bishop in Constantinople. The people in Constantinople are going to be closer to that bishop than they are the bishop in Rome. But we do know the bishop in Rome is the more powerful. In 391, Christianity actually becomes the official faith of the Eastern Empire or the Byzantine Empire. There's a large Jewish population in that empire, but Christianity will become the official faith. We do see some differences emerge between the Eastern and Western Christianity, and this is going to lead to that Great Schism that I talked about. So in the Eastern part, it's going to really be led by the bishops in the East, particularly the bishop in Constantinople. In the West, the bishop in Rome is going to be in control. But they have particular views on things like communion and the bread used at communion, and there are going to be some differences within that. We also are going to see Islam spreading during this time period, and Islam will actually spread into the West, particularly on the Iberian Peninsula where modern day Spain is, and we do see Islamic people move into Spain. And this is going to be trying for the Christians that are in Spain at the time. The monarchy will eventually launch something called the Reconquista, and this will take place in the 1400s, and they're trying to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula and push Islamic people out of the Iberian Peninsula, but they have been there for a really long time by the 1400s. So, we said that there are differences in the Eastern and Western Church. The Western Church will eventually become the Roman Church or the Roman Catholic Church. During the time of the decline of the Roman Empire and Islamic expansion, one Western institution remained, the Christian Church. The church centralized and set up hierarchical administration. There were bishops, there were priests, and then there were common people that were believers. The church had special privilege. So it had special privileges like it could collect tithes. It also had land in all the kingdoms that were Christian kingdoms. It had a lot of wealth. Monks and their culture are really, really important, and they thrived during this time period. Like I said, monks copy the books, these religious texts, and spread them. But you can learn more about monks and their culture in the other PowerPoint on Blackboard. But we will see divisions in Christianity. Like I said, there will be division between the East or Byzantium versus the West, and we're going to see Orthodox Christianity develop in the East and Roman Catholicism develop in the West. Why does this happen? Well, there are a lot of differences in these different areas. There are linguistic differences and cultural differences. If we look at Roman Catholics, they're going to use Latin. They're also dealing with things like doctrinal authority. Does the Pope have as much control as the Roman Catholic Church says he does? Then there are issues with the Lord's Supper, particularly the bread. And then there's this issue with veneration of images. If you go into a Catholic church today, do you see images of saints? Do you see images of Jesus Christ? If you go into an Orthodox church, do you see venerations of images? So think about that. See if you can answer that question, because there's a divide there with veneration of images. One of the barbarian tribes actually turns into a kingdom, and it's the Franks. Under the leadership of a man named Clovis, a new dynasty will be established. It's called the Merovingian dynasty. And under Clovis, the Franks will expand their territory and grow to control a lot of territory. They will control modern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Western Germany. The way Clovis does this is he turns to the tribes and he tries to develop loyalty. He realized that loyalty laid with the tribes. So that's one way he's able to take over so much territory. These Merovingian kings will make pacts with the landed noble of these tribes, and they will actually give them an office. They create an office for them. It's the office of the count. The Franks' power declined, and it will begin to decline by the 7th century, and the power moves from the king to a person called the mayor of the palace. And we will see a new dynasty come from the mayor of the palace's office. It will be called the Carolingian dynasty. And it will be named this because Carolus, later known as Charlemagne, served as the mayor of the palace. But he'll later become king. He starts this Carolingian dynasty. Charlemagne will rule from 768 to 814, and he really wants to expand the territory and conquer more territory. He wants it to be an even larger kingdom for the Franks. So he focuses on conquest, and one of his earliest conquests was over the Lombardy people in northern Italy. And he does this in 774. By the time Charlemagne dies in 814, Charlemagne's kingdom includes the land in modern-day France, Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, almost all of Germany, much of Italy, part of Spain, and the island of Corsica. So you can see how you go from Clovis and the territory that he did. You can see how this really has changed the Franks' kingdom. If you look at the territory that they have when Clovis is king compared to Charlemagne, Charlemagne has added a lot of land to the Franks' kingdom. He even really wanted to be a universal emperor. And one way that he decides to make his empire more stable is he is going to promote the church and Christianity throughout his empire. He thought that that could link the people together. Even if they had differences, the church would tie them together. And eventually Charlemagne does become an emperor in 800. So a little bit more about Charlemagne, the king of the Franks. Like I said, he put together this large kingdom that stretches from modern-day France to modern-day Poland, and it was the first large-scale European government since the fall of Rome in 476. Charlemagne was seen as a well-rounded man. He was a warrior, politician, patron of religion, and he was a fan of education. So he is seen as a well-rounded person. He doesn't just focus on warfare, he also focuses on religion and education. Under his rule, the empire is decentralized, but it's based on personal relationships. So rather than control everything, the kingdom is going to be controlled based on his personal relationships. Charlemagne actually traveled throughout the kingdom. He visited the wealthy people and asked for support. And that's one way he keeps his relationships with the people in his empire good, because he travels and he talks with these people. He will be named the Holy Roman Emperor in 800, and he's named Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800. It's really ironic because Charlemagne was not holy, he wasn't a Roman, and he didn't even really see himself as an emperor. He wanted to be, but he really preferred to call himself King of the Franks. But remember I said that he really liked religion and education. During his time period, we will see a Renaissance that will be called the Carolingian Renaissance, and there will be some reform within the church. There will be a new form of the Christian Bible, and liberal arts education will flourish. So this is one example of culture during the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. Now, Europe is mostly going to be an agrarian economy during the Middle Ages. The agrarian economy of the Middle Age organized and controlled through village farms called manors. The manors were worked by a group of peasants, sometimes called serfs. They served as farmers and were subordinates to the manor's lords. The lords gave peasants land and a place to live or dwelling in exchange for protection and assistance. But like I said, some of these peasants are called serfs. So this is also tied to feudalism. Now I'll talk a little bit about the hierarchy of feudalism. Feudalism forms the basis for European life for hundreds of years during the Middle Ages. Lords would give land to a person called a vassal. The vassal would agree to provide the lord with protection and tax money. The king is the top lord, so the king will give land to vassals or other lords that promise to provide protection and tax money to the king. Vassals can give some of their land away and become lords. So these lords that give their land away, they have people below them. The land that is controlled by the vassals becomes known as a manor. So the lord would have a manor. Below the lord, you would have serfs and peasants working the land, but they could also be used as soldiers for the lord, because the lord is a vassal of the king and they have to provide protection for the king. The serfs and the peasants also had to pay taxes to the local lord, because the local lord had to pay taxes to the king. The serfs were stuck on the land that they were born to, but they were not slaves. We can think of it like dirt in the field. It cannot be removed or carried away. Serfs cannot be removed or carried away from the land that they're born on. They cannot be sold individually like slaves. Instead, if a person wanted to buy the work of serfs, they would actually have to buy the land that the serf lived on. So serfs cannot be sold individually, but they are tied to the land that they are born and live in. And if a person wanted to control those serfs in particular, they would have to own the piece of land that they lived on. We're going to shift gears and talk about the High Middle Ages from 1000 to 1300. The High Middle Ages, as I said, is from 1000 to 1300. We will see the creation of incorporated cities. Cities could become incorporated, which gave the residents a direct relationship with the king. They bypassed local lords because they were cities and they were directly tied to the king. Town members had to pay the local lord for loss of revenue and had to pay the king for the right to incorporate. So why would people do this if they had to pay the local lord for loss of revenue and they had to pay the king for a right to incorporate? Well, they do this for power, to control their own affairs and to make their own laws, because if you incorporate as a city, that city could make their own laws. And the other reason they do this is because they could set up trade groups. And these trade groups at this time are called guilds. And guilds still exist today. So let's just take an example of a metal worker. Metal workers would have guilds.
An example is blacksmith.
And they would have different levels of people in those guilds. So at the very bottom would be an apprentice, somebody learning the skill. Then there would be journeymen, so they've been practicing a while, but they're not quite a master. And at the very top, there would be a master. But these guilds could do things, and they had collective bargaining power, and so they could control prices, and they could look out for one another. During the High Middle Ages, we will see some struggles between the church and the state. The church has become very powerful by this point in 1000 AD, but at the same time that the church was becoming very powerful, so were lords and kings. At this point, lords would give land to the church, but then they wanted to control the affairs of the local church. But the church does not like this. The church thought that they should be in charge of the churches since it was a religious establishment. So there are going to be tensions that emerge because the wealthy people that are contributing land and ties to the church believe that they should have some influence over it. But the church is like, no, that's not okay. Why would lords give land to the church? One reason they do this is for prestige. If you give a large gift of land, everybody would know about it and it would be known throughout, and you would gain this level of prestige. It would also give the poor a place to stay, and it brought tourism money in. But lords and kings are not happy as the church authority grows because they want some say so in the local church. The king actually attempts to control bishops, and this will lead to the investiture controversy. And this will eventually lead to the Pope having control over all spiritual matters. And kings and emperors will be given control over all political matters. So there's a divide. The Pope controls spiritual matters, the king and emperors control political matters. So education is taking place during the High Middle Ages, and there are three teachers you really should know during this time period. Anselm of Canterbury, he lives from 1033 to 1109. And he taught that one's intellect could observe the world and understand the Christian God. What this means is you look out and see what happens in the world, and if you really pay attention to what's going on in the world, you would understand God. He also says that because people can imagine and perceive the existence of a greater being, that there must be a greater being. This greater being is God. The next teacher that you should know is a teacher named Bernard, and he lives from 1090 to 1153, and he believes that logic can be used to enhance spirituality. So to better understand your faith, you can use logic to better understand your faith. He believes that this enhanced spirituality will lead to the kingdom of heaven. The third teacher's name is named Peter
Abelard,
and he lives from 1079 to 1142. So they all live around the same time period. And he believed that logic could be taught on its own without religion. So he actually believes that you can learn logic without looking at God or spirituality. You can just make rational decisions and learn logic without religion. This is a philosophy of education, and it becomes very popular. And it will actually lead to the formation of modern universities because they're trying to study logic outside of religion. So these are three varying different degrees on logic and how people think and education during this time period. What else is going on? There are a series of wars going on called the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of holy wars that existed between Christians and Muslims beginning in the 11th century, and they were fought into the early 13th century. Why the Crusades? Why did these series of wars take place? Late in the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire was under pressure from a group of Islamic people called the Seljuk Turks, and this will lead to some issues, and eventually we'll see the First Crusade emerge. The First Crusade takes place from 1096 to 1099, and Christian crusaders from Europe will march on and take Jerusalem in July 1099. But there will be other crusades. There will be a second and a third crusade, and European Christians will go and they will try to secure Jerusalem for the Christians, but this does not work during the second and third crusade. Christians fail to secure Jerusalem. And then there's a fourth crusade that takes place from 1202 to 1204, and it's very commercial. We will see the Venetians sponsor a lot of soldiers to go and do this crusade, and eventually these soldiers will take over Constantinople in 1204. But the Crusades do show this tension that is emerging. But the Crusades do show this tension that exists between Christians and Muslims during this time period as they're trying to expand and take over territory and spread their religious beliefs. Cathedrals are really going to be a symbol of opulence and wealth during the High Middle Ages. Most will be built in towns, and they're built in towns to show off wealth. And so we're going to look at some of these towns that build cathedrals and talk about 4 different cathedrals. And we're really looking at modern day France. During this time, France will build 80 cathedrals and 500 abbeys between 1180 and 1270. But there are going to be competitions between cities. Paris itself, or near Paris, there will be 2 cathedrals that are built. St. Denis's Cathedral, built in 1144, and Notre Dame, and it is in Paris. It will be built in 1163. Outside of Paris, but still near to Paris, there will be 2 other cathedrals that are built. The cathedral at Chartres will be built in 1194, and then there will be a cathedral built in Beauvais in 1247. And these cathedrals are going to have different styles. There are 2 types of cathedrals that will really be built during this time. There will be Romanesque cathedrals. They're older style cathedrals with rounded arches, thick walls, stone roofs, and small windows. These were really fortresses pretending to be a church. And then there are newer style Gothic churches that have pointed arches, large stained glass windows, tall ceilings, and flying buttresses. Now, I have 2 images here below. They are 2 cathedrals from France. Can you identify the Romanesque cathedral, and can you identify the Gothic cathedral? So you can see that the older style is the Romanesque, and the one with pointed arches and larger windows will be the Gothic cathedral. So what about women during this time period? We can look at the ideal versus the reality. The ideal image of a woman during this time period is often women being celibate, living a life of chastity, poverty, and obedience. So the ideal was women should either be a housewife or a nun. But that is not necessarily the reality. The reality was that the majority of women during this time period were working women. They did work within their home. There were home-based businesses, and most young women, ages 10 to 15, would apprentice and learn a skill. So what businesses are women participating in? They're participating in food-based and clothing industries. So they're preserving food, growing food, but they're also weaving and making clothes. But the ideal is for women to be a housewife or a nun. We do know that that's not the case for most women during this time. Most of them will be working from home. So now we're going to shift gears and talk about the late Middle Ages, and this kind of overlaps with the High Middle Ages because the High Middle Ages really ends in 1300, but we're looking at the time period from 1200 to 1500. We will see national monarchies emerge, particularly in England and France in the High and Late Middle Ages. We can look at England, and we will see a leader emerge named William the Conqueror in 1066. He will win the battle at Hastings and take the English crown, and he will maintain land in Normandy. He is actually a Norman, and he conquers England when he wins the Battle of Hastings and he takes the English crown. He will set up a dynasty. William's grandson will be Henry II. He will rule from 1154 to 1189, and he will expand lands for this monarchy. He will expand lands, especially in France. Henry II has 2 brothers, Richard the Lionhearted and John, and they will also rule over England, and they will require England to increase taxes during this time period. One reason that they are doing this is because they want to pay for the Crusades. A legal document emerged during this time period, during this monarchy. It will be called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta comes out in 1215. So the Magna Carta will be signed in 1215. This is actually during the rule of King John, Henry II's younger brother. And what is it? Well, basically, King John had become very unpopular. There were groups of lords that were basically going up against King John, and a religious leader in Canterbury will step up and help them negotiate a peace and it will come out being the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta addresses several things. One thing it addresses is church rights and legal protections for those lords, and it also addresses justice, or basically the criminal justice system, and how people would have access to justice, so access to trial and those types of things. And it also addresses payment to the crown. These lords were tired of paying so much money to King John, and so it addresses payment to the crown. But it's this legal agreement between the king and his lords, and so it's going to be a very significant document. Now we'll turn to France. The Norman conquest of England allowed France to push to control English-occupied territories in France. So when the Normans conquer England, they're basically going to create this opportunity for the French to come in and try to take control of English-occupied areas in France. So on July 27th, 1214, the French won a very big victory over the English and Germans, and this allowed France to unify under a king, and this king's name is Philip Augustus. Eventually, his grandson will help grow this monarchy. His grandson is Louis IX, and he will reign from 1226 to 1270, and he will really grow the French bureaucracy, so the French government and how they manage the French government and the French monarchy. What else is going on during this time period? It will be during this time period, the late Middle Ages, that we will see a plague emerge, and it will be called the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, or simply the plague. The disease is known as the bubonic plague, and it traveled from Asia and arrives in Europe in 1347. One way that it gets there is because it will travel along trade routes from China, and we know that it was carried by fleas and rats. And so this is a flea from a rat, and this is a particular type of flea that spreads the bubonic plague. The disease actually begins with painful bulls in your lymph node glands. If the bull was lanced, opened, and drained, sufferers had a small chance to survive. Because victims would bleed under the skin, they would start coughing up blood, and they would go delirious from the high fevers that were caused by the Black Death. The victim typically died within 2 to 3 days after showing the first symptoms. This plague was very deadly, and it had a major impact on Europe. The chances of getting the Black Death was roughly 90%, and the overall mortality of this particular plague was around 70%. We know that at least 25 million people died from the Black Death, but modern research really believes that it's closer to 50 to 60 million.
In Europe, but the disease was also in Asia and Africa.
But this bubonic plague, as we said, it was about 50 to 70% fatal. As it starts out as bubonic plague, it's 50 to 70% fatal. But if it moves down to the pneumonic plague, so pneumonia sets in, it will become 100% fatal. So a lot of people will die as this Black Death occurs and as people develop more and more symptoms. So let's take a look at the Black Death a little more. So why was the Black Death so deadly? There was no resistance to the disease. It had not been seen in over 800 years, so people didn't have immunity to this particular disease. If the disease became pneumonic, meaning that it spread to the lungs and developed into pneumonia, it was 100% fatal. The other reason that it was so deadly is it mutated. So it mutated so that it could transmit from person to person. It originally started out with fleas and rats. Well, eventually it mutates and it's able to spread from person to person. We also know that during this particular time period, there are a lot of serfs and peasants, and hunger persists among this population. And this population often had poor nutrition. So their hunger and their poor nutrition weakened the people, and then they were exposed to the Black Death, and that led to even more cases of the Black Death. We also see a lack of sanitation during this time period. Medieval Europe, or the Middle Ages in Europe, is very dirty, very dirty. So, what are the reactions to the plague? If you look here, you can actually see a plague doctor. And this image is actually resurged as we've been going through our own plague, the COVID pandemic. But what are the reactions to this Black Death or bubonic plague? The immediate reaction to the plague is there are a lot of church clergy that die in large numbers. So your church members are dying in large number. And people are looking for someone to blame. Why is this happening? Why are so many people dying? Why are they going through this pain? And who can they blame for it? So some people will react with parties, some people will look toward religion, and some people will look toward being by themselves. There are some long-term reactions to the plague. The plague really changes the demographics of Europe. Millions of people died, so there aren't as many people in Europe. So the survivors got the better land. There's also not as many people stressing the food supply. So there is more food available after the plague. There's also going to be a rise in wages because wages will go up due to a demand for labor. We know that there are going to be jobs that need to be completed, and particularly if you have skill, you could demand a higher wage because there are not as many people. We will also see peasant revolts in both England and France during this time period. They want more rights, they want more access to land, things like that. And people are going to start marrying earlier. Because there are not as many people, they need to start thinking about marriage. And we will see high birth rates after the plague. There will also be a war called the 100 Years' War. But we're going to talk about the 100 Years' War in the next lesson. So I'll see you for lesson 11, and we'll talk about the 100 Years' War in that particular lesson. Have a good week.